These are very interesting texts to read on the last Sunday of our mini-series on the Sacraments. Because in it, Jesus breaks the law and then uses David breaking the law to justify himself and his disciples breaking the law. How in the world does that have anything to do with the sacraments? Well, I think the whole thing is an important warning about not taking, it's a warning about taking things so seriously that you completely miss the point of the thing that you're taking seriously. So let's look at these two sections. First, we'll look at David. David is on the run from King Saul. He and Jonathan had just met for the last time. They had their farewell, and David just booked it out of town because Saul was getting ready to kill him. And so David's first stop is to go to the tabernacle where the Ark of the Covenant is and seek the Lord's guidance. And blatantly lie about the entire purpose of why you're there to the priest. He shows up and says, "Hey, I need some food. I'm on an urgent mission for the king." He's not. But the priest is like, "Well, I guess if you're on an urgent mission and you need food, I've got some of the consecrated bread." Now, this bread is special. These are 12 loaves of bread that are set on a table in the holy place in the tabernacle. The entire purpose is to symbolize Israel's perpetual sacrifice of their work to God. The whole way it works is on the day before a Sabbath, bread is baked, and then on the Sabbath, you put bread on this table, taking the old bread away, and then the priests eat that bread. This is holy bread, and David eats it after lying to a priest. Not looking real good for David at this point. So Ahimelech the priest, thinking he's doing a great deed, does all this for David, and then David's like, "Oh, and I need a sword too." And Ahimelech, thinking he's doing this great deed for David because he's helping out the king, helping out David, is like, "Oh, I've got the sword of Goliath, the guy that you killed. That'll do." And then in the part of the story that we didn't read, do you know where David goes next? A little town called Gath. Do you know where Goliath was from? A little town called Gath. He goes to the town of the guy he is famous for killing with the guy he killed's sword to Gath. And then he proceeds to act like he was crazy and chew doors and drool all over things to not get killed by the people of Gath that he went to. David has a couple moments of being not very smart after he'd completely lied to a priest. But it's interesting that Ahimelech will do this for David because this is the start of a principle that develops in Judaism, and it has a name in Hebrew that I can't remember, but the principle is basically called saving a life. And it's the idea that if human life is in danger, pretty much any of the laws in the Old Testament you can throw out in order to save that life. This expands to if a Jewish woman is in labor on the Sabbath, she can drive to the hospital, or the Jewish husband can drive her to the hospital because that's fine. That's considered saving a life. If someone is hurt and a doctor gets called in to do doctor stuff, that's okay because it's saving a life. There's up to, I think, murder and a couple other things. You can throw out any of the Jewish laws if it's to save a life. That becomes important, by the way. So David, in need of food, goes to Ahimelech. Ahimelech says, "Well, you're hungry. We can break these laws. Have some food." So then fast forward to Jesus. Jesus is in a field and his disciples are hungry. So, how many of you have seen wheat fields? Wheat grows up, there's wheat on the end of a stick. It's very wheaty. So, the disciples are just like, "Well, we're hungry." So they start picking some grain. And the Pharisees see it and are like, oh, it's the Sabbath. You're doing work. You can't do that. Now, this may or may not have actually been breaking Sabbath law, because it was considered perfectly okay to eat stuff, but because they were harvesting grain, the way the Pharisees defined the Sabbath, they were harvesting grain, which was forbidden. Now, they were taking a couple pieces off of the wheat and eating it. I wouldn't exactly call that harvesting grain, but in their mind, it was harvesting grain. So they pointed this out to Jesus, and Jesus just goes, David ate consecrated bread. The priests have to work on the Sabbath, and you don't go yelling at them. If you knew what it meant that God desires mercy, not sacrifice, then you wouldn't even bother bringing this up in the first place. And then Jesus goes into the synagogue, because it's the Sabbath, and there's a guy there with a shriveled up hand. And the Pharisees asked Jesus, hey, is it okay to heal somebody on the Sabbath? And Jesus, you can almost see it in the text. Jesus just glares at them and goes, if your sheep falls down a well, do you get them out on the Sabbath? And he proceeds to heal the guy's hand. I love when Jesus is snarky. It's very fun. Because, really, they're like, oh, can you heal somebody on the Sabbath, Jesus? And he's like, yes. The Jews revere the Sabbath. So Jesus doing these things on the Sabbath, it's just enough to weird them out, but it also points out this reminder that if you're going to do good, it's not bad to do on the Sabbath. It's good to do good on the Sabbath, even if it's good work. It's good because it's good work. This seems like a really simple concept to understand, but Jesus has to take a lot of time explaining it. And keeping the Sabbath to Jews is important as the sacraments are to us, because the Sabbath is just one of those, it's the big deal. Sacraments for us are kind of the big deal. But just like the Jews sometimes get a little bit too uppity about the Sabbath like they did in Jesus' day, we sometimes get a little bit too focused on details of sacraments and miss the entire point. For instance, my favorite example is Holy Communion is really important, so let's have it 4 times a year. You know, I've brought up the churches that get in these huge fights over how often you're supposed to have communion, right? Holy Communion's super important, so let's do it less often. It almost doesn't make sense. They're coming at it from a good place. Holy Communion is important, and somehow their brains started saying, so then if we have it less, then it becomes more important because we don't have it as often. And I'm always like, but if it's important, you should be doing it all the time, which is why we have communion every week, because I like having communion every week. I think often when Jesus says often means often. So when it comes to Holy Communion, you might have noticed that I'm not too picky about who gets it. Have you ever noticed that? If someone comes up to communion, if they're not a very obviously too young child, they get communion. Even if it is an obviously too young child and the parent is like, yeah, they take communion, I give them communion. Because I'm not so concerned about who's taking communion, I'm more concerned with missing someone who should take communion. Does that make sense? Because communion is important. And if communion is something that is good for us, as we've been discussing the past couple of weeks as we've talked about the sacraments, we ought to take communion. And the whole reason why, the thing that makes someone worthy to take communion anyways, is the same thing I say every week up on the screen while we're taking communion. It's not because we're worthy enough to take the sacrament, it's because Jesus is worthy and his worthiness makes us worthy. That's why Holy Communion, I offer it to anyone who wants it. The same goes for baptism. Well, if somebody's going to get baptized, there's some instruction beforehand to make sure that they understand the thing that's going on, especially with parents, because there's some promises and you want to make sure they understand what the promises are. But if somebody wants to be baptized, I'll baptize them, because baptism is important. It's a thing that is good for us as Christians. I'm not going to withhold that unless I have a very good reason. Because in baptism, a sinner is made worthy through being joined with Christ's death and resurrection. But I've known some folk who get very uptight, for lack of a better term, about these things. In trying to keep the sacraments holy, they start to exclude instead of include. Some of our Lutheran brothers and sisters are notorious for excluding folk from communion, where if you're not a member of that church, you don't get to take communion. And they're doing it from a good place. They're coming at it from the place of communion is important and we want to make sure you're not taking it wrongly. But I think they're missing the point of what communion is. Because if you really think about it, don't we all come forward to take communion wrongly? If who took communion was up to our own merit, we wouldn't measure up. But again, it's Jesus' merit that makes us worthy to take communion, by which our sins are forgiven. Because the sacraments are for all of us. And just like Jesus says, it's okay to do good on the Sabbath, even if you're breaking the law, it's okay to take the sacrament. And I would rather give someone communion and have them not deserve it than miss giving someone communion who needs it. Because I believe that the sacraments are powerful. I believe that when we receive the sacraments, God is doing something in us. When we are baptized, God is doing something. When we take communion, it is God that is doing something. And I don't want to leave anyone out of that. In Mark's account of this scene with Jesus talking about the Sabbath, he says, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. And I think that same expression applies to the sacraments. The sacraments are God giving something good to us. Not, he didn't make us because sacraments exist. These are things that are meant to benefit us, to draw us closer to God and to each other, and not things to drive us apart. Because the whole reason for the sacraments was so that sinners can receive grace. Not just a few select sinners, but all sinners. Because the sacraments are how God uses his sacrifice to grant us his mercy.